Chapter 21. Nesta's head went silent as Elaine's words finished sounding in the room. Feyre had twisted in her seat, face white with alarm. Nesta shot to her feet. No! Elaine remained in the doorway, her face pale but her expression harder than Nesta had ever seen it. You do not decide what I can and cannot do, Nesta. The last time we involved ourselves with the cauldron, it abducted you, Nesta countered, fighting her shaking. She found the words, the weapons she sought. I thought you didn't have powers anymore. Elaine pursed her lips. I thought you didn't either. Nesta's spine straightened. No one spoke, but their attention lingered on her like a film on her skin. You will not go looking for it. Amren said coolly, So you look for it, girl. Nesta turned to the small female. I don't know how to find anything. Like calls to like, Amren countered. You were made by the cauldron. You may track other objects made by it as well, as Briolin can. And because you are made by it, you are immune to the influence and power of the trove. You might use them, yes, but they cannot be used upon you. A glance to Elaine. Either of you. Nesta swallowed. I can't. But to let Elaine involve herself, jeopardize her safety. Amren said, You tracked the cauldron. It nearly killed me. It trapped me like a bird in a cage. Elaine said, Then I will find it. I might require some time to reacquaint myself with my powers, but I could start today. Absolutely not. Nesta spat, fingers curling at her sides. Absolutely not. Why? Elaine demanded. Shall I tend to my little garden forever? When Nesta flinched, Elaine said, You can't have it both ways. You cannot resent my decision to lead a small, quiet life, while also refusing to let me do anything greater. Then go off on adventures, Nesta said. Go drink and fuck strangers, but stay away from the cauldron. Feyre said, It is Elaine's choice, Nesta. Nesta whirled on her, ignoring the warning flicker of primal wrath in Rhys's stare. Keep out of this, she hissed at her youngest sister. I have no doubt you put these thoughts in her head, probably encouraging her to throw herself into harm's way. Elaine cut in sharply. I am not a child to be fought over. Nesta's pulse pounded throughout her body. Do you not remember the war, what we encountered? Do you not remember the cauldron kidnapping you, bringing you into the heart of Hybern's camp? I do, Elaine said coldly, and I remember Feyre rescuing me. Roaring erupted in Nesta's head. For a heartbeat, it appeared that Elaine might say something to soften the words, but Nesta cut her off, seething at the pity about to be thrown her way. Look who decided to grow a pair of claws after all, she crooned. Maybe you'll become interesting at last, Elaine. Nesta saw the blow land like a physical impact, in Elaine's face, her posture. No one spoke, though shadows gathered in the corners of the room, like snakes preparing to strike. Elaine's eyes brightened with pain. Something imploded in Nesta's chest at that expression. She opened her mouth, as if it could somehow be undone. But Elaine said, I went into the cauldron too, you know. It captured me. And yet somehow all you can think of is what my trauma did to you. Nesta blinked, everything inside her hollowing out. But Elaine turned on her heel. Find me when you wish to begin. The doors shut behind her. Every awful word Nesta had spoken hung in the air, echoing. Feyre said to her, gratingly gentle, It wasn't an easy choice for me to ask Elaine to endanger herself like this. Nesta twisted to Feyre. Can't you find the trove? She hated each cowardly word, hated the fear in her heart, hated that in merely asking she'd exposed her preference for Elaine. You've got all that magic, and you were made yourself, even if it wasn't by the cauldron. You trained. You are a warrior. Can't you find it? Again, that silence, but a different kind, like a thunderhead about to break. No, Elaine said quietly. I can't. She looked to Rhys, who nodded, his eyes shining. Everyone watched Feyre now, but Feyre's attention remained fixed upon Nesta. I can't risk it. Why? Nesta snapped. Because I'm pregnant. Silence fell. Silence, and then Cassian let out a whoop of such joy that it shattered the fraught silence into smithereens, leaping from his chair to tackle Rhys. They went down in a tangle of wings and dark hair, and then Amren was saying to Feyre, light dancing in her eyes, "Congratulations, girl." Asriel stooped to press a kiss to Feyre's head, or an inch from it. I knew that stupid shield wasn't just to practice something Helion taught you, Cassian was saying, giving Rhys a smacking kiss on the cheek before turning to Feyre and grabbing her to him. Rhysand relented on the shield enough that Cassian could wrap his arms around her, still laughing. And as Rhys dropped the shield, Feyre's scent filled the room. It was Feyre's usual scent, only something new, a smaller, softer scent like a budding rose lay within it. Cassian laughed. No wonder you've been a moody bastard, Rhys. I suppose we're about to learn a whole new level of overprotective. Feyre glowered at him, then up at her mate. We've already had discussions about this. The shield is a compromise. Amren smiled broadly. What was his starting offer? Feyre scowled. That he never leave my side for the next 10 months. The Fae took longer to grow children, Nesta had learned from poring over the books in the house's library during her initial weeks here, a month longer than a human pregnancy. How far along are you? Asriel asked, gazing at Feyre's still flat stomach. She slid her fingers over it, as if anyone's attention there made her wish to protect the child inside. 2 months. Cassian pivoted toward Rhys. You've been hiding this for 2 months? Rhys threw him an arrogant smile. We thought you'd all guess it by now, to be honest. Cassian laughed again. How can we guess when you've got her bundled in that shield? Moody bastard, remember? Cassian grinned and said to Asriel, We're going to be uncles. Feyre groaned. Mother help this child. Asriel's own grin bloomed at that, but Feyre's gaze slid to Nesta. Nesta said quietly to her sister, Congratulations. For she'd said nothing, had only been able to stand and watch them all, their joy and closeness, as if she were looking in through a window. But Feyre offered her a tentative smile. Thank you. You'll be an aunt, you know. Gods help this child indeed, Cassian muttered, and Nesta glared at him. She turned to Rhys and Feyre and found the former watching her carefully, the epitome of ease with his arm around his mate's shoulders, the gleam in his eyes one of pure threat. Nesta let him see it then, that she bore no will ill toward Feyre or the babe. Some primal part of her understood that Rhys was not only male, but a Fey-male, and he would eliminate any threats to his mate and child. That he'd do it so slowly and painfully, and then walk away from her shredded corpse without an ounce of regret. It was self-preservation, perhaps, some new Fey instinct of her own, that had Nesta bowing her chin slightly, letting him see she meant no harm, would never hurt them. Rhys's own chin dipped, and that was that. Nesta said to Feyre, Did you tell Elaine? Before Feyre could reply, Asriel said, What about more? Feyre smiled. Elaine was the only one who guessed. She caught me vomiting 2 mornings in a row. She nodded toward Asriel. I think she's got you beat for secret keeping. I'll tell more when she returns from Valahan, Rhys said. Given your reaction, Cass, I don't trust that she can keep her excitement to herself if I tell her while she's there, even if she doesn't say anything to them. And I don't want a potential enemy knowing. Not yet. Varian? Amren asked. Nesta had never learned the story of how the female and the Summer Court's Prince of Adriata had become entwined. She supposed now she never would. Not yet, Rhys repeated, shaking his head. Not until Feyre's farther along. Nesta angled her head at her sister. So you can't do magic while pregnant? Feyre winced. I can, but given my unusual set of gifts, I'm not sure how it might impact the baby. Winnowing is fine, but some other powers, when we're so early in the pregnancy, could strain my body dangerously. Rhys's hand tightened on her shoulder. It's a pain in the arse. Feyre flicked at the hand gripping her arm. As much of pain in the arse as he's become. Rhys winked at her. Feyre rolled her eyes. But then she said to Nesta, Elaine will need time to dust off her powers to try and see the trove. But you, Nesta, you could scry again. Rhys added, as swiftly as possible. Time is not our ally. Nesta asked Amren, You're not made? Not as you were, Amren said. She gave Nesta a wicked grin. Afraid? Nesta ignored the taunt. Even Cassian's bright happiness had faded. What choice do I have? Nesta asked. If it was between her and Elaine, there was no choice at all. She would always go first if it meant keeping Elaine from harm, even if she'd just hurt her sister more than she could stomach. You do have a choice, Rhys said firmly. You will always have a choice here. Nesta threw him a cool look. I'll search for it. She glanced at her sister's stomach, the hand idly resting atop it. Of course I'll search for it. Cassian wanted to have a word with Rhys about the Illyrian legions, so Nesta found herself walking to the front entry of the river house alone. She made it halfway down the hall when Feyre called her name, and Nesta paused, right in front of the painting of Ramiel. Feyre's smile was tentative. I'll wait with you until he's done. Don't bother, Nesta almost said, but reined it in. They walked in silence to the main entry, all those paintings and portraits of everyone but her and their mother watching them. The quiet tightened, becoming nearly unbearable as they halted in the sprawling foyer. Nesta could think of nothing to say, nothing to do with herself, until Feyre said, It's a boy. Nesta whipped her head toward her sister. The baby? Feyre smiled. I wanted you to know first. I told Rhys to wait until I'd told you, but... Feyre chuckled as renewed shouts of joy echoed down the hall. I suppose he's telling Az and Cassian now. But Nesta needed a breath to sort through it. The offering of kindness Feyre had extended, what she had revealed. How can you possibly know its sex? The smile faded from Feyre's face. During the conflict with Hybern, the bone carver showed me a vision of the child I'd have with Rhys. How did he know? I don't know, Feyre admitted, her hand again drifting to her stomach. But I didn't realize how much I wanted a boy until I knew I'd bear one. Likely because having sisters was so horrible for you. Feyre sighed. That's not what I meant. Nesta shrugged. Feyre might say that, but the feeling was no doubt there. Everything that had just happened with Elaine. Feyre seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts. Elaine was right. We've become so focused on how her trauma impacted us that we forgot she was the one who experienced it. It was directed at me, not you. I've been guilty of the same things, Nesta. Sorrow dimmed Feyre's eyes. It was unfair for Elaine to level that truth only at you. Nesta didn't have an answer to that, didn't know where to start. Why not tell Elaine about the baby's sex first? She discovered the pregnancy. I wanted you to know this part before anyone else. I hadn't realized you were keeping score. Feyre gave her an exasperated look. I'm not, Nesta. Do I need an excuse to share things with you? You're my sister. I wanted to tell you before anyone else. That's it. Nesta didn't have an answer to that either. Thankfully, Cassian's voice filled the hallway as he bid his farewell to Rhys. Good luck, Feyre said softly before rushing to meet a jubilant Cassian, and Nesta knew her sister didn't only mean with the dread trove. Chapter 22. Do you think Nesta can find the trove? Asriel asked Cassian as they relaxed in the sitting room that separated their bedchambers, flames crackling in the hearth before them. The night had turned chill enough that they needed the fire, and Cassian, who'd always loved fall despite the pricks in the autumn court, savoured the warmth. I hope so, Cassian hedged. He couldn't stomach the thought of Nesta putting herself in danger, but he understood her motivations entirely. If he'd had to pick between sending one of his brothers into danger or doing it himself, he would always choose himself. Though he'd winced at every harsh word that had come out of Nesta's mouth to Elaine, he couldn't fault the fear and love behind her decision. Could only admire that she had stepped up, if not for the good of the world, then to keep her sister safe. Asriel said, Nesta really should do a scrying. Cassian gazed across the space between their two armchairs. They'd sat in them, before this fire, so many times that it was an unspoken rule that Asriel's was the one on the left, closer to the window, and Cassian's the one to the right, closer to the door. A third sat to Asriel's left, usually for Rhys, and a fourth to Cassian's right, always for Mor. A lace-lined golden throw pillow adorned the fourth chair, a permanent mark of her ownership. Amryn, for whatever reason, rarely stayed here long enough to see this room, so no chair had ever been held for her. Nesta isn't up for a scrying, Cassian said. We don't even know what power she still has left. But Elaine had confirmed it for everyone. Both sisters still possessed their cauldron-gifted powers. Whether they were as powerful as before, he had no idea. You do know, though, Asriel countered. You've seen it, even beyond when it glows in her eyes. Cassian hadn't told anyone about the step he'd found with the clear finger holes burned into it. He wondered if Asriel had somehow learned of them, the news brought to him on his shadow's whispers. She's volatile right now. The last time she did a scrying, it ended badly. The cauldron looked at her, and then took Elaine. He'd seen every horrific memory flash before Nesta's eyes today, and though he understood that Elaine had spoken true, claiming the trauma of that memory, Cassian knew firsthand the lingering horror and pain of a loved one stolen or hurt. Asriel stiffened. I know. I helped rescue Elaine, after all. Az hadn't so much as hesitated before going into the heart of Hyburn's war camp. Cassian leaned his head against the back of the chair, rustling his wings through the gaps crafted to accommodate them. Nesta will scry on her own, eventually, if she's capable. If Brialyn and Kozdai find just one of the dread trove items, let Nesta try it her way first. Cassian held Az's stare. If we go in and order her to do it, it'll backfire. Let her exhaust her other options before she realizes only one is viable. Asriel studied his face, then nodded solemnly. Cassian blew out a breath, watching the flames leap and flutter. We're going to be uncles, he said after a moment, unable to keep the wonder from his voice. Asriel's face filled with pride and joy. A boy. It wasn't a guarantee that a High Lord's firstborn would be his heir. The magic sometimes took a while to decide, and often jumped around the birth order completely. Sometimes it found a cousin instead. Sometimes it abandoned the bloodline entirely, or chose the heir in that moment of birth, in the echoes of a newborn's first cry. It wouldn't matter to Cassian, though. if Rhys's son inherited his world-shaking power, or barely a drop. It wouldn't matter to Rhys either. To any of them. That boy was already loved. "I'm happy for Rhys," Cassian said quietly. "So am I." Cassian looked over at Az. "You think you'll ever be ready for one? Ever be ready to confess to more what's in your heart?" "I don't know," Azriel said. "Do you want a child?" "It doesn't matter what I want." Distant words, ones that prevented Cassian from prying further. He was still happy to be Mor's buffer with Azriel, but there'd been a change lately, in both of them. Mor no longer sat beside Cassian, draped herself over him, and Azriel, those longing glances toward her had become few and far between, as if he'd given up. After 500 years, he'd somehow given up. Cassian couldn't think why. Az asked, "Do you want a child?" Cassian couldn't stop the thought that flashed, of him and Nesta against the wall a level below, her hand rubbing him exactly the way he liked it, her moans like sweet music. He'd left her unsatisfied. She'd run off before he could even make it even between the two of them. He'd gone up to Windhaven after the meeting earlier, and hadn't seen her at dinner. Wasn't even sure what the hell he'd say to her, how they'd have a conversation. It was like the unfinished bargain inked across their backs, that imbalance of pleasure, and a matter of what he ashamedly could call male pride. She had the upper hand now, had looked so damned smug when she'd cut him off. Quick off the mark? His knee bounced, and he glowered at the flame. "Cassian?" He realized Azriel had asked him a question. Right, about children. Of course I want children. He'd contemplated it often, what manner of family he'd build for himself, how he'd make sure his children never spent a moment thinking they were unloved and unwanted, never ever spent a moment hungry or scared or cold or in pain. But no female had ever come along who'd tempted him enough to fight for that future. He supposed, deep down, that was what he was holding out for, the mating bond, what he'd seen between Feyre and Rhys. Cassian blew out another breath and got to his feet. Azriel lifted a silent brow. Cassian aimed for the door. He wouldn't be able to rest, to focus, until he evened the playing field. As he entered the hall, he muttered without looking back, "Turn a blind eye, chaperone." Curled up in bed, a book propped on the thick down comforter, Nesta was just getting into the sizzling first kiss in her latest novel when a knock thudded on her door. She slammed the book shut and sat up against the pillows. "Yes?" The handle turned, and there he was. Cassian still wore his leathers, the overlapping scales of them full of shadows that made him look like some great, writhing beast as he shut the door. He leaned against the carved oak, his wings rising high above his head like twin mountain peaks. "What?" She slid the book onto the nightstand, sitting up further. His eyes dipped to her sleeveless silk nightgown, then quickly returned to her face. "What?" she demanded again, angling her head. Her unbound hair slid over a shoulder, and she saw him mark that too. His voice was rough as he said, "I've never seen you with your hair down." She always wore it braided across her head or pinned up. She frowned at the locks that flowed to her waist, the gold amongst the brown glimmering in the dim light. "It's a nuisance when it's down." "It's beautiful." Nesta couldn't stop her swallow as she lifted her gaze. His eyes were blazing, yet he remained leaning against the door, hands trapped behind his body, as if he were physically restraining himself. His scent drifted to her, darker, muskier than usual. She'd bet all the money she didn't have that it was the scent of his arousal. It set her pulse hammering, careening so far off the path of sanity that she scrambled after its vanishing leash. To let him affect her so easily, so greatly. Unacceptable. She didn't dare look below his waist, not as she shaped her lips into a cool smile. Here for more? I'm here to settle the debt between us. His words were guttural, her toes curled beneath the blanket. But her voice remained surprisingly calm. What debt? The one I owe you for last night. He spoke as if there was no room in him for teasing, for humour. His eyes drifted lower than her face, noting the hammering of her pulse. We have unfinished business. She grappled for anything to guard against him. Male pride is a thing of wonder. When he didn't respond, she threw another wall his way. Why are you even here? You made it clear enough that last night was a mistake. He was having none of it. I never said that. His attention remained fixed on her hammering pulse. You didn't need to. I saw it in your eyes. His gaze snapped to hers. The only mistake was that I came before I could taste you. Nesta knew he didn't mean her mouth or her skin. Cassian went on. The only mistake was that you ran off before I could get on my knees. Breathing became difficult. Won't your friends tell you this is a mistake? She gestured to the air between them. My friends have nothing to do with this, with what I want from you. He said it with such intent that her breasts pebbled. His eyes dipped again, and when he saw her nipples hard against the silk of her nightgown, his entire being seemed to focus on it, on her, all 500 years of being a trained warrior, an apex predator, all of it narrowing on her. His appraisal enveloped her like a rush of wind, of fire. What about training? She breathed. This stays out of training. His eyes had turned wholly dark. Her skin tightened, becoming almost painful as she went molten and throbbing between her legs. Nesta. A note of pleading had entered his voice. He was trembling, the door behind him rattling with the force of his deteriorating self-control. She looked then, below his waist, at what strained against his pants. Her head emptied out, and there was only him and her and the space between them. Cassian let out a growl, the sound a plea as well. She made herself say, This stays out of training and everything else. This is just sex. Something shifted in his expression, but he said, Just sex. This was sure to be a mistake, sure to be something she paid for, suffered for, but she couldn't bring herself to deny him, deny herself. Just for tonight, she'd allow it. So Nesta met his eyes again, took in every trembling, restrained inch, and said, Yes. Cassian lunged for her, a beast free from its cage, and she barely had time to twist toward the edge of the bed before his lips were on hers, devouring and claiming. Deep purring sounds vibrated from his chest through her fingers as she clawed off his jacket, his shirt ripping through the fabric. He tore his lips from hers only long enough to pull his shirt away, the fabric snaring on his wings before falling to the floor. Then he was on her again, climbing onto the bed, and she spread her legs for him, letting his body fall into the cradle between her thighs. She couldn't stop her moan as he drove his hips into hers, the leather of his pants sliding against her. He plunged his tongue into her mouth, the kiss like a brand, one hand sliding up her bare thigh, tugging her nightgown with it. When he reached her hip and still had found no underwear, he hissed, looked to where he pressed his hardness against her and realized that only the leather of his pants separated him from her wetness. She was shaking, and not from fear, as he took a trembling hand and slid her nightgown higher, pulled it up to her navel and then stared at her, bare and gleaming, pressed against the bulge in his pants. His chest heaved, and she waited for that brutal, demanding touch, but he only leaned down and pressed a kiss to her throat. Tender and coaxing. Cassian pressed another to her shoulder, and she shivered more as he dragged his tongue over the spot. He kissed the hollow of her throat, licked it. He slipped the straps of her nightgown down her arms, kissed her collarbones. With each kiss, he pulled down the neck of her nightgown further, until his breath warmed her bare breasts. Cassian let out a sound from the back of his throat, from his gut, like some sort of starved, tormented creature. He stared at her breasts, and she couldn't breathe under that burning gaze, couldn't breathe as his head dipped and he wrapped his lips around her nipple. Nesta arched off the bed, a breathless sound rupturing from her. Cassian only repeated the movement on her other breast, and then raked his teeth across the sensitive peak before clamping down lightly. She moaned then, tipping her head back, thrusting her chest up toward him in silent plea. Cassian let out that dark laugh and returned to her other breast, teeth grazing, teasing, biting. She strained her hands toward him, toward where he'd gone still between her legs. She needed him, now, in her hand or her body, she didn't care. But Cassian only pulled away, pulled up, and knelt before her, surveyed her spread beneath him, her nightgown a bunch of silk around her middle, everything else bared to him, his own feast to devour. "I owe you a debt," he said in that guttural voice that made her writhe. He watched her hips undulate and braced his large, powerful hands on either thigh. He waited for her to signal that she understood what he intended, what she'd dreamed of for so long in the darkest hours of the night. In a choked whisper, she said, "Yes." Cassian gave her a feral, purely male smile, and then his hands tightened on her bare thighs, spreading them wider. His head lowered, and all she could see was his dark hair gilded by the lights and his exquisite wings rising above both of them. He didn't waste time with gentle touches and tastes. Parting her with one hand, he dragged his tongue clear up her center. The world fractured, reformed, and fractured again. He cursed against her wetness, and he reached down with his other hand to adjust himself in his pants. He licked her again, lingering at the spot atop the apex of her legs, sucking it into his mouth, teeth nipping before he withdrew. She arched, unable to stop the moan breaking from her throat. Cassian's tongue ran downward in an unhurried sweep, and he pressed a hand to her abdomen, stilling her, as he slid his tongue straight into her core. It curled into her, driving deeper than she'd expected, and she couldn't think, couldn't do anything but luxuriate in it, in him. "You taste," he growled against her, making his way up again toward the bundle of nerves in short, teasing licks. "Even more delicious than I dreamed." Nesta whimpered, and he flicked his tongue there. Her whimper turned to a cry, and he laughed against her and flicked his tongue again. Release became a shimmering veil, just beyond her grasp, but drifting closer. "So wet," he breathed, and licked at her entrance as if determined to consume every drop of her. "Are you always this wet for me, Nesta?" She wouldn't allow him the satisfaction of the truth, but she couldn't think of a lie, not with his tongue pumping in and out of her, coaxing her toward but still denying her the pleasure and relentless pounding she so badly needed. Cassian snickered, as if he knew the answer anyway. He licked her, his silken hair brushing over her belly, and looked up to meet her gaze. As their eyes locked, he slid a finger into her. She cried out, and he trailed a hand from her thigh to hold her open again as he licked at that spot while his finger pumped in and out of her in a teasingly slow rhythm. More. She wanted more. She undulated her hips against him, hard enough to drive his finger deeper. "Greedy," he murmured onto her, and withdrew his finger nearly to its tip, only to add a second finger as he plunged back in. Nesta let go entirely then, let go of any sanity and any pride as he filled her with those two fingers. He sucked and nibbled, and release gathered around her like an iridescent mist. Cassian growled again, given over to whatever need drove him, and the reverberations of that sound echoed into places of her that had never been touched. In and out his fingers slid, stretching and filling, all while he tasted and savoured. Nesta rode his hand, his face, grinding into him with abandon. Holy gods! Cassian's teeth grazed against her. Nesta! The sound of her name on his lips against her most sensitive place sent her mind scattering into eternity. She bowed off the bed with the force of her climax, and he became ravenous, fingers pumping and pumping, tongue and lips moving against her, like he'd devour her pleasure whole. He didn't stop until she'd collapsed against the mattress, until she was limp and reeling and trying to piece her mind back together. The slide of his fingers out of her left her empty and aching, the removal of his tongue and mouth from between her legs like a cold kiss. Cassian was panting, still hard as he rose up and stared at her. She couldn't move, couldn't remember how to move. No one had ever done that to her, made her feel like that. It had knocked the breath from her, the thoroughness of her pleasure, like the world could be remade in the force of what had erupted from her. She just watched the carved, heaving muscle of his chest, his wings, his handsome face. Nesta reached for the cock she was dying to feel, to taste, but he backed off the bed. Cassian grabbed his shirt and aimed for the door. We're even now. Chapter 23. Watching Nesta climax had been as close to a religious experience as Cassian had ever had. It had rocked him to his very core, and only pure will and pride had kept him from spilling in his pants again. Only pure will and pride had made him back off the bed when she'd reached for him. Only pure will and pride had made him leave the room when all he'd wanted was to plunge his cock into that sweet, tight warmth and ride her until they were both screaming. He couldn't get her perfect taste out of his mouth, not as he washed for bed, not as he pumped himself dry, soaking his sheets, not as he ate breakfast. Couldn't stop feeling the clamp of her around his fingers like a burning, silken fist. He'd washed his hands 12 times by the time he faced Nesta in the training ring, and he could still smell her there, could still feel her, taste her. Cassian banished the thought from his mind, along with the knowledge that Nesta might have felt good on his fingers, on his tongue, but it would be nothing compared to how she'd feel on his cock. She'd been tight enough that he knew it'd be paradise and madness, his undoing. And she'd been so drenched for him that he knew he'd do deplorable things to be allowed to taste that wetness again. The Nesta who emerged into the training pit was the one he saw every morning, though. No hint of a blush or a sparkle in her eye to tell him she'd enjoyed herself. But maybe that was because Asriel walked in behind her. His brother took one look at him and smirked. Az knew. Could either scent Cassian or Nesta, or could already scent Nesta on Cassian, even from across the ring. Cassian didn't regret what he'd done with her. Not at all. And maybe it was the fact that it had been 2 years since he'd had any sort of sex, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd been so ridden by his own base need. Some small, quiet part of his brain whispered otherwise. He ignored it, had ignored it for a long time now. "Morning, Az," Cassian said cheerfully. He nodded to Nesta. "Ness, how'd you sleep?" Her eyes flashed with the anger that was like kindling to his own, but then she smiled coolly. Like a babe. It was to be a game, then. Which one of them could pretend that nothing had happened the longest? Which one of them might seem the least affected? Cassian threw her a grin that declared he was in, and he'd make her crawl before the end. Nesta merely began to unlace her boots. He jerked his chin toward Asriel. "Why are you up here?" "I thought I'd do some training myself before heading out for the day," Az said, his shadows lingering in the archway, as if fearful of the bright sunlight in the ring. "I'm not interrupting anything, am I?" Cassian could have sworn Nesta's fingers stalled on the laces of her boots. He drawled, "Nothing at all. We're starting on hand-to-hand combat." "My least favourite," Asriel said. Towing off her boots, Nesta asked, "Why?" Az observed her, striding barefoot into the ring. "I like swordplay better. Hand-to-hand is too close for my tastes." "He doesn't like getting a face full of someone's armpit sweat," Cassian said, chuckling. Asriel rolled his eyes, but didn't deny it. Nesta watched the Shadow Singer with a frankness that most people shied from. Asriel returned the look with a stillness that most people ran from. Even Feyre had been hesitant around Az initially, but Nesta considered him with the same unflinching assessment she laid upon everyone. Maybe that was why Asriel had never said a bad word about Nesta, never seemed inclined to start a fight with her. She saw him, and was not afraid of him. There weren't many people who fit that bill. Nesta said, "Show me how you two fight." Asriel blinked, but she added, "I want to know what I'm up against." When neither of them said anything, she asked, "What I saw in battle was different, wasn't it?" "Yes," Cassian said. "A variation of what we do here, but it requires a different sort of fighting." Shadows clouded her eyes, as if the memory of those battlefields haunted her. He said, "We won't start battle training for a while yet. Years, probably." Az was watching her as if he too had marked the shadows in her eyes. Cassian asked him, "You want to do a little sparring? It's been a while since I wiped the floor with you." He needed to get the energy out, the lingering, addling desire from last night. Needed to burn it from his body through movement and breath. Az rolled his shoulder, unruffled and calm, eyes glittering as if he marked Cassian's need to expel that coiled-up energy. But Az peeled off his jacket and his shirt, leaving the siphons atop the backs of his hands anchored in place around the wrist with a loop over his middle finger. Cassian did the same as he removed his own shirt. Nesta's stare seared him from across the ring. Cassian might have flexed his stomach muscles as he approached the chalk-lined circle. Az shook his head and muttered, "Pathetic, Cass." Cassian winked, nodding to his brother's equally muscled stomach. "Where have you been exercising these days?" "Here," Asriel said. "At night." After he returned from spying on their enemies. "Can't sleep?" Cassian took up a fighting stance. A shadow curled around Asriel's neck, the only one brave enough to face the sunlight. "Something like that," he said, and settled into his own stance across from Cassian. Cassian let it drop, knowing Az would have told him already if he'd wanted to share what had been hounding him enough to exercise at night, rather than in the morning with them. Cassian explained to Nesta, who stood a few feet outside the chalk ring, "We'll go full speed, then stop, and I'll break it down for you, all right?" He needed to expunge this energy before he'd dare let himself be that close to her. Nesta crossed her arms, face so neutral he wondered for a moment if he'd dreamed some wild fantasy last night of his head between her legs. Shaking off the thought, he again looked to Az. Their eyes met, Az's face as unreadable as Nesta's, and Cassian gave a nod. "Begin." It started with footwork, a slow circling, an assessment, waiting for the other to reveal his first move. Cassian knew Asriel's tricks, knew which side Az favoured and how he liked to strike. The problem was, Az knew all of his techniques and shortcomings too. They circled each other again, Cassian's feet pounding a steady beat on the dry ground. "Well," he asked Az, "why don't you show me what all that nighttime brooding has resulted in?" Az's mouth curved. He refused to take the bait. The sun beat down on them, warming Cassian's bare skin and hair. "Is this really all it is?" Nesta asked. "Circling and taunting?" Cassian didn't dare look her way, not even for an instant. As soon as he so much as blinked at her, Asriel would strike, and strike hard. But Cassian grinned and glanced toward Nesta. Az fell for his deception, launching toward him at last. Cassian, waiting for it, met the fist Az sent flying for his face, blocking and deflecting and counter-striking. Az caught the blow, ducked the second Cassian had waiting, and aimed one for Cassian's exposed ribs. Cassian blocked, counter-punched, and then the sparring unfolded. Fists and feet and wings, punch and block, kick and stomp, breath soaring out of them as he and Az tried to break past each other's defences. Neither of them put the full force of their bodies into the blows, not the way they'd do in a real brawl, when one punch could shatter a jaw. But they used enough power to make Cassian's ribs bleat at the impact, to make Az whoosh out of breath as Cassian landed a lucky hit to his stomach. Az was spared from having the air knocked out of him by twisting, otherwise the fight would have ended right then and there. Around and around the ring, fists flying, teeth bared, and fierce grins, they lost themselves to sweat and sun and breathing. They'd been born for such things, endured centuries of training that had honed their bodies into instruments of violence. To allow their bodies to do just what they wished was its own sort of freedom. Faster and faster they fought, and even Cassian's breathing became laboured. Though Cassian had more bulk, Azriel was quick as hell. They were evenly matched. They might be at this for hours, if they were truly facing each other as enemies. Might have been at it for days, if they'd been opponents in one of the old wars, where entire battles had come to a standstill to watch great heroes go head-to-head. But time wasn't unlimited, and he did have a lesson to get through with Nesta. "Right," Cassian panted through gritted teeth as he blocked Az's kick and bounced a step back, circling again. "Whoever lands the next blow wins." "That's ridiculous," Az panted back. "We go until one of us eats dirt." Az had a vicious competitive streak. It wasn't boastful and arrogant, the way Cassian knew he himself was prone to be, or possessive and terrifying like Amren's. No, it was quiet and cruel and utterly lethal. Cassian had lost track of how many games they'd played over the centuries, with one of them certain of a win, only for Az to reveal some master strategy, or how many games had been reduced to only Rhys and Az left standing, battling it out over cards or chess until the middle of the night, when Cassian and Moore had given up and started drinking. They circled again, but Az snapped his head toward Nesta, eyes wide. Cassian looked, heart leaping into his throat. Azriel struck, a punch to the jaw hard enough that Cassian staggered. Reeling, steadying himself, he cursed. Az let out a soft laugh, eyes flickering. He'd wielded the same deception that Cassian had used at the start of this, played the one card that would get Cassian to remove his focus from an opponent. It had happened before, against Highburn. Nesta had screamed his name, and even in the midst of the battlefield he'd abandoned his soldiers and rushed for her, not caring about anything other than reaching her, saving her. Only Nesta had saved him, and she had screamed his name to get him out of the cauldron's range. His soldiers had been blasted apart a moment later, and when he'd looked at her face, he'd understood something. Something that the past year and a half had shredded apart and turned cold. Cassian rolled his shoulder, hand at his jaw as he said to Az, "Bastard." Az laughed again, and they turned toward Nesta. She remained a pillar of cool calm, but a line of colour stained her cheeks. There was no wind to blow her scent to him, but from the way her throat bobbed as she glanced between them, Azriel let out a cough and walked toward the water station. "You're drooling," Cassian said to her, and Nesta went rigid. "If there was anything enticing," she hissed, entering the ring, "it was seeing Azriel punch your face." Cassian motioned for her to get into her fighting stance. "Keep telling yourself that, Ness." "What do you know of the Dread Trove?" "The what?" Gwen turned from the desk where Nesta had found the priestess singing softly to herself, situated just outside Meryl's shut office door. "The Dread Trove," Nesta said, wincing at her sore body's protestations as she took a seat on the edge of Gwen's desk. 3 ancient artifacts. Gwen shook her head. "I've never heard of such a thing." Nesta was still sweaty from the lesson with Cassian and Azriel. They'd walked her through the punches and kicks and steps they'd done with ease, though neither had laughed when she was clumsy or ungraceful. Seeing them spar had been overwhelming. Their beautiful forms, tattooed and scarred and carved with muscle, gleaming with sweat as they fought with a viciousness and intelligence she'd never seen. She'd been sweating herself when they'd finished, wondering what it would be like to be between those two male bodies, letting them turn all that lethal attention on worshipping her. Elaine would faint to hear such thoughts, and to hear that Nesta had already had two males in her bed, not just once, but twice, and had enjoyed every second of it. But the males Nesta had shared herself with hadn't looked like Cassian and Asriel, hadn't been Cassian and Asriel. Nesta made herself focus during the lesson, but as soon as she'd left them in the training ring, filthy thoughts had poured in, leaving her half distracted while she'd walked down to the library. The thought of Cassian pumping into her mouth while Asriel pounded into her from behind, the two of them working her in tandem. Talking to Gwen about the Dread Trove had sobered her up fast enough. "It seems like the Trove has a glamour to make people forget that it exists," Nesta said to Gwen, and succinctly explained what it was, along with the vague details about why it was wanted. She didn't mention Queen Brialyn, or Koshai, or the Cauldron, only that the Trove must be found quickly, and that Gwen should not mention it to anyone. Nesta supposed that in doing so she directly disobeyed Rhys's orders for silence, but to hell with him. When she was done, Gwen was wide-eyed, her face so pale that her freckles stood out in stark relief. "And you must find it." "I don't have the faintest idea where to begin looking, which one to find first." Gwen chewed on her bottom lip. "We do have an extensive card cataloguing system," she mused idly, but peered toward the stacks beyond them, to the open pit at the bottom of the library. "But they don't list what's below level 7. "I know." Gwen angled her head. "So why come to me?" "You're clearly good at what you do, if you're working with someone as demanding as Merrill. If you have a spare moment, any help would be appreciated, or just point me in a direction." "Let me finish proofing this chapter, and then I'll see what I can discover." Nesta offered a tight smile. "Thank you." Gwen waved a hand. "Finding objects to help our court protect the world is rather exciting, about as exciting as I'm willing to get these days, but it shall be an adventure." "You could come to training if you want another sort of adventure," Nesta said carefully. Gwen offered a tight smile. "That's not for me, I'm afraid." "Why not?" Gwen gestured to Nesta's fighting leathers, the overlapping scales. "I'm not a warrior." "Neither am I, but you could be." Gwen shook her head. "I don't think so. If I wished to be a warrior, I would have gone that route as a child. Instead, I offered myself as an acolyte, and that is what I am." "You don't have to give up one thing to be the other. Training is exercise, learning to breathe and stretch and fight. Aren't you researching Valkyries for Merrill? That might even give you further insight." Nesta patted a thigh. "And I already have muscle building up. 2 weeks and I can tell the difference." "Why would a priestess need muscular thighs?" Nesta narrowed her eyes as Gwen went back to her work. "Is it Cassian?" "Cassian is a good and honourable male." "I know he is." She'd always known it. She pressed. "But is it Cassian's presence that makes you hesitate?" There had been no hint this morning as to what had gone on between them last night, as if the debt between them had been paid, and he had no further interest in touching her, like she was an itch scratched, and that was that. Or perhaps he had not enjoyed it as she had. It unsettled her that she spent so much time thinking about it. Gwen didn't answer, and Nesta knew she had no right to push, not when colour stole over Gwen's cheeks and her head bowed slightly. Shame. It was shame and fear. Something in Nesta's chest tightened as she began to walk away. "All right. Let me know if you learn anything regarding the Trove." Nesta mulled the conversation over during the hours she worked. When she checked the sign-up sheet as she left the library at sundown, no names had been added. She felt Clotho's eyes on her as she surveyed the empty page. Nesta at last turned toward the priestess, seated at her desk with her hands folded before her. Silence stretched between them, but Nesta said nothing as she left. She went to the stairwell rather than to her room or the dining room, and stared down into the curving redness of the steps. Nesta began the descent, slower this time, contemplating each placement of her foot. Let each step downward be a thought, a piece of one of Amren's puzzles that she sifted through. Down and down she went, turning over each word and glance from Gwen during the time Nesta had worked in the library. Step to step, she told herself with each burning, trembling movement of her legs. Step to step to step. Again, she replayed the conversation. Each step was a different word, or motion, or scent. Nesta was on step 2000 when she halted. She knew what she had to do.